The poor student spilled milk on my clothes, and the next day my childhood friend bullied her for me. I said it wasn't necessary, but then I caught him cornering her again. If I kiss you, will you let me go?" she stammered. Lance Sheffield smiled lazily. "What else?" At that moment, I finally realized we were on different paths. 2 weeks later, the poor student staged being bullied, and Lance kicked over my desk. "Esther Lawrence, are you mental? All this over a cup of milk? Is it worth it?" he shouted. I calmly picked up my bag. "I'm sorry, but I have an alibi. I was applying for a transfer yesterday. I'm leaving tomorrow." Ding! This novel reminds you to click the subscribe button in the bottom right corner to read the complete novel. Lance Sheffield was the talk of our entire high school. Tall, handsome, and smart enough to be in the top 10 without even studying. And everyone knew that I was his only soft spot. Not to be provoked, not to be touched. Otherwise, there would be no good outcome. "Esther, when do you think Lance will let that poor girl off the hook? He's been skipping classes for a week now, just to corner Irene." My pen trembled slightly. I looked up towards the seat not far away. Empty. I lowered my eyelids and replied nonchalantly, "I don't know." The dismissal bell rang at that moment. I hugged my packed homework books and left the classroom with my desk mate. She was still chattering away. Tisk, well, I suppose I can't fathom the mind of such a wife-obsessed maniac. I suddenly felt a lump in my throat. Obsessed? A few days ago, when the poor girl accidentally spilled milk on me, Lance's face darkened instantly. As he gave me his school uniform to change into, others were reminding the poor girl to apologize. Huh? It was just an accident. Do I really need to apologize? That milk was quite expensive, you know. She grumbled, unwilling. Someone pulled her aside and whispered, "You don't know how protective Lance is of Esther. If she's unhappy, Lance might just end you." Hearing this, she let out an "oh" and reluctantly said sorry. Meanwhile, Lance helped me clean my desk, never once glancing at her. The whole class knew. I was Lance's childhood sweetheart, the person he cared about most and was determined to protect. But now, I let out a dry laugh and stopped my desk mate. "Actually, Lance and we're not that special." Huh? She looked confused. Seeing that I didn't continue, she followed my gaze towards the school gate. In a nearby alley, Lance and the poor girl were standing extremely close. They said something, and the girl's breath almost touched Lance's face. There were many people passing by. If you didn't look carefully, they blended into the shadows of the alley and weren't particularly noticeable. Lance's lips curled into a smile, his tone casual. "What else do you owe me today?" As we agreed, Irene Quill's face was flushed red, not daring to look at him. She stood on her tiptoes and quickly kissed his cheek. "Bloody hell! This!" My desk mate was dumbfounded. Unable to hold back, she exclaimed in shock. With just that outburst, Lance turned his head, and our eyes met. As our gazes crossed, the air froze for a moment. The person beside me belatedly covered her mouth. "Sorry, carry on, I didn't see anything." Then she fled like the wind. I tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, at a loss for words. I smiled faintly. What a coincidence, I'm heading home too. Lance's gaze fell on me, neither light nor heavy. He said nothing. We stood there in silent confrontation for 3 seconds. As I turned to leave, I heard Irene's voice. "Lance, is she upset? Don't worry about her." My heart ached for a moment. I pushed it down and quickened my pace. Having known Lance for 19 years, I suddenly realized he might not be the person I remembered anymore. 3 days ago, when I learned he had started targeting Irene, I specifically explained to him. "I don't care about such trivial matters." "But I do," he said, his demeanor serious, enunciating each word. "Your health isn't good. I won't let anyone bully you." We had grown up together since childhood, and this was the most he had ever said to me. But it was also that day. I stumbled upon him cornering Irene against the wall of the assembly hall. Irene was sobbing. Just a kiss and you'll let me go?" Lance shed his usual cold and distant demeanor. Smiling casually, he said, "What else?" I don't remember how I left the assembly hall. My legs were stiff, and my chest felt so tight I could barely breathe. For the rest of the afternoon, I couldn't focus on a single lesson. Later, I finally convinced myself that people change. Since we're no longer on the same path, we shouldn't walk together anymore. The next day during morning study hall, Lance didn't show up. Everyone was used to his skipping class. But my desk mate hesitated, unsure whether to ask. She did anyway. "Didn't you come to school with Lance?" Usually, we'd enter the classroom together. In summer, he'd buy me breakfast. In winter, he'd prepare a hot water bottle for me on the way. This was something everyone took for granted. But today I had avoided the route past his house. Seeing my hesitation, my desk mate tactfully changed the subject. "Oh, by the way, what are you planning to eat after study hall?" When study hall ended, Lance arrived. He was carrying a bag of hot cheese balls. "Oh my God, don't you have to go really far to buy those?" "Esther, you're so lucky. Can I have one?" Someone leaned towards me. But Lance didn't even glance my way. He placed the bag of cheese balls in front of Irene Quill. Then he went back to his seat and started napping. There was a moment of silence around us. Did he put them in the wrong place? Did the young Master Sheffield's eyes deceive him? Irene glanced in my direction, noticing the girl who had just asked for one. She covered the bag. "Sorry, Lance bought these for me. I'm not sharing with anyone else." No one paid much attention to her words. Everyone's hesitant gazes were focused on me. Finally, someone couldn't resist asking, "Did you two have a fight?" No way, Lance usually can't protect Esther enough. How could he suddenly change like this? I wasn't too surprised. Since it was out in the open, there was no need for him to keep pretending. The atmosphere around us was somewhat embarrassing. I couldn't muster any expression, just pulled out my meal card from my desk. We didn't have a fight. I should explain to everyone, Lance and I are just ordinary classmates. There's no other relationship between us whatsoever. I left the room after saying this. The uniform Lance had draped over his face suddenly fell off. He lifted his eyelids to look at me, his gaze cold and hard, fixed in midair. My mum noticed the subtle change between Lance and me. For several days in a row, he didn't come to my house. He used to always do homework with me. Though he didn't actually write anything. He just liked to prop his chin up and stare at me writing, his fingers idly twirling the ends of my hair. I found it annoying and would swat at him. He'd just smile with a quirk of his brow, like a sly fox. "Finished? Want to go for a walk?" I'd feign anger. "Lance, if you're not going to write, don't disturb me. Then kick me out." He'd switch arms to lean on. His tone was cheeky, clearly knowing I wouldn't do that. Sometimes I'd write until very late. He'd accidentally fall asleep beside me. When leaving, at the door, he'd stretch lazily and wave at me with a smile. "See you tomorrow." That was the relationship between Lance and me. Nothing explicitly stated, he lingered in my days, deliberately leaving his mark. Flamboyantly giving me all his favoritism. So who wouldn't like someone like that? I liked Lance. I'd also carefully imagined our future together over and over. Maybe we'd be together, maybe after graduation he'd earnestly and gently take my hand and confess to me. Thinking of this, Irene Quill's face suddenly flashed in my mind. Lance holding her in his arms, smiling as she stood on tiptoe to bring her lips close to his. I squeezed my eyes shut, my eye sockets aching with pain. My mom was asking me, "Hasn't Lance been walking home with you lately? Did you two have a fight? Your teacher called Jenna and said Lance is dating someone, it's not you two." I shook my head, interrupting her. "It's not with me." My mom was stunned for a moment, about to say something else. I suddenly looked up and asked her, "Didn't Central High School try to persuade me to transfer a few days ago for their admission rate?" "I've thought it over. I'll go." Before, Lance had told me he hoped to always stay by my side. I had the same wish as him. But now, I had no reason to stay here anymore. Lance and I tacitly began to keep our distance. His relationship with Irene became common knowledge. In the past, people had speculated about Lance and me being together. But our interactions never crossed the line, so those rumors remained mere conjecture. Now things were different. Lance was skiving off classes with Irene, and even the teachers knew about it. During PE, my desk mate suddenly rushed over to me. "Esther! Lance is about to beat someone to death. Quick, go stop him." I was momentarily stunned. A fight? I remembered that in the past, when Lance got into fights, it was usually for my sake. I went over and found Lance pinning someone against the wall. Both had blood on their lips. He wiped his mouth casually and raised his fist again. "I'll ask one more time. Are you going to apologize to her or not? I've already bloody said I didn't insult her shoes, for God's sake." Irene was hiding behind Lance, sobbing. He definitely looked at my shoes funny. Lance was about to throw another punch. But he caught sight of me from the corner of his eye and hesitated for a moment. I understood then. He was doing this for Irene. I decided not to interrupt his heroic moment. Just as I was about to leave, the guy pinned to the wall took advantage of Lance's distraction to kick him away and grab me. I was startled, recognizing him as the notorious school bully. Well, if it isn't your little childhood sweetheart? You dare accuse me and beat me up? Lance, if you don't apologize right now, I'll give her a punch." He gripped my arm tightly. I started to panic. "What does your quarrel have to do with me?" He ignored me and looked at Lance. "Scared now, aren't you? I heard you care about her quite a bit." Perhaps out of fear, I found myself harboring expectations of Lance that I shouldn't have. In the past, he would have done everything to protect me. But as I was about to ask for help, the words caught in my throat. Because Lance laughed first. "You must have heard wrong." He lifted his eyelids, his gaze passing over me lightly. "Go ahead and hit her. But I won't let you off for what you did to Irene." I stared at him blankly as he wiped Irene's tears and walked away. A furious curse came from above me. "Bloody hell, I don't believe this." The bully gritted his teeth and punched me in the face. I blacked out. The punch was too painful. I had never known what it felt like to be hit before. In my memory, Lance had suffered many such injuries. Sometimes it was from fighting for me, other times from being beaten by his father for not studying. He would always come to me for help with treating his wounds. "It hurts so much, Esther. Don't you feel sorry for me?" he would say pitifully. My heart would race at his words. As I applied iodine to his wounds, I would ask, "Can't you just study properly? Then your dad wouldn't hit you." Lance fell silent. I only asked this question once. That day, the atmosphere between Lance and me became unusually tense. Later, I learned the truth. Lance's parents had actually divorced long ago and even had new partners. But for Lance's sake, they still pretended to be happily married. Ever since Lance discovered this, he started fighting, skipping classes, and even staying out all night, pushing everyone away. After learning this, I never again tried to persuade him to study hard. He had his own way of fighting against the world. He seemed to lack a sense of security and would ask me, "Esther, I won't be able to get into as good a university as you in the future. Will you stop talking to me?" I shook my head. "Never. I'll always be by your side." The dream ended there. I could hear people arguing nearby. It sounded like Lance's father. "What are you thinking? It's bad enough you don't study, but you just stood by and watched while Esther got beaten like this." Lance's mother was crying beside him. "How could you do this, child? You know Esther had a concussion when she fell from upstairs as a child. Didn't you always say you would protect your little sister?" Lance, who had been silent until now, suddenly clicked his tongue impatiently. He kicked over something near his foot. "Damn it, what protection? Isn't she human? Why does she need my protection?" Lance's father suddenly slapped him across the face. His voice trembled with anger. "That Irene Quill. Who does she think she is to make you stand up for her? Heh. Lance laughed softly. Yeah, she's willing to skip classes with me, to fight alongside me. What does Esther Lawrence amount to anyway? The noise around me grew louder as I opened my eyes. My head was throbbing. A tear rolled from the corner of my eye onto the pillow. I finally understood why Lance Sheffield liked Irene Quill. As for all those years we had spent together in each other's lives, in the end, they meant nothing. My mum noticed I was awake. She had been sitting with her head bowed, but quickly stood up to help me. My gaze drifted to Lance. The moment our eyes met, he looked away. His expression was unnatural. Apologize to Esther right now. Lance's father pulled him to my bedside. Lance remained silent. I could see his fists clenched tightly, his face full of defiance. I had never seen Lance like this before. He had always looked at me with a smile. Suddenly, I felt a pang of hurt. I wished I had never met Lance Sheffield. If we were strangers, perhaps I wouldn't feel so devastated. Yet it was he who had always cared about my poor health. He was the one who made me take that punch. And now it was he who stood here coldly, saying I meant nothing to him. Say something, Lance. You and Esther used to be so close. Now we're asking you to apologize, and this is your attitude. Lance remained stubborn, unwilling to yield to his parents. I suddenly found the whole situation absurd. I let out a calm laugh. There's no need to apologize. Can he just leave? Lance's gaze trembled, looking somewhat shocked. We had never experienced such a tense atmosphere between us before. I repeated myself. Get out. I don't want you in my hospital room. At this point, Lance hesitated. I didn't know what he was thinking. Perhaps to him, Irene Quill, who skipped classes with him, was his true youth. That's fine. From now on, we should never interfere in each other's lives again. I spent a week in the hospital before returning to school. My concussion had flared up again, forcing me to wear a brace. I was only back to avoid falling behind in my studies. After all, I was transferring to a new school in 2 days. Irene Quill came to see me with a packet of sweets, placing them on my desk. She smiled sweetly and said, Esther, I wanted to apologize on Lance's behalf for leaving you with that thug before. I'm sorry about that. I didn't even look up. No need. She let out a surprised oh. Esther, are you really holding a grudge? That thug didn't seem to use much force, you know. You're not pretending to faint to get Lance's attention because you fancy him, are you? I frowned and glanced over at her. In the distance, Lance was leaning back lazily in his chair, his gaze drifting vaguely in our direction. Before I could respond, Irene suddenly laughed. Oh, I'm only joking. After all, Lance has said he only sees you as a sister, and quite a burdensome one at that. She was clearly trying to assert her dominance over me. It seemed she was still concerned about Lance's past attitude towards me. I twirled my pen cap, too annoyed to bother with her. Whatever makes you happy. As soon as I said that, Irene's eyes suddenly welled up. Her voice became choked with emotion. Esther, I'm sincerely apologizing to you. Why do you always have to be so sharp with me? Is it because? She looked at the sweets on the desk, tears streaming down her face. Is it because you think I'm poor and look down on the sweets I bought? As she started crying, Lance came over. He protectively put her behind him and spoke coldly. Esther, if you have a problem, take it out on me. What's the point in bullying her? Bullying her? I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. Then I grabbed the packet of sweets from the desk and tossed it into the rubbish bin behind me. See that? That's what bullying looks like. Irene cried even harder, burrowing into Lance's embrace. Lance said nothing. He just stared at me, his gaze heavy. Before afternoon classes, I suddenly noticed another packet of sweets on my desk. It was the brand I'd loved since childhood. I turned my head to see Lance leaning against the back door, lazily lifting his eyelids. It's the kind you like. Consider it my apology, all right? I stared into his eyes. Then I turned and tossed it in the bin with Irene's sweets. I don't want it. Stop bothering me. I've always wanted to attend the University of Edinburgh. For 3 years in high school, my grades have consistently been in the top 3 of my year. I've won numerous awards in various competitions, both big and small. Entering Central High School would give me a better chance at securing a spot. For the remaining time, I deliberately avoided Lance Sheffield and Irene Quill. I spent most of my breaks in the staff room. But Lance seemed to skip fewer classes now, and I kept running into him at school. Once in the cafeteria, a lunch lady passing by nearly spilled hot oil on me. Lance pulled me away just in time. "Watch where you're going, bookworm. Is your head so full of equations you can't see straight?" A few drops of hot oil still splashed onto my arm. He pulled out some tissues and wiped it for me. "Are you burned? Let me take you to buy some burn cream." I remained silent and took a couple of steps back. He looked up, his gaze meeting my cold stare. I didn't want to talk to him and turned to leave. Lance took one long stride and easily blocked my path. "Esther, is this really necessary? Are you this upset just because Irene and I are together?" I was forced to stop. Lance was a head taller than me, so I had to look up to see his face clearly. I was truly speechless and couldn't help but laugh. "What am I upset about? Lance, we may have grown up together, but you don't actually think I fancy you, do you?" Lance was stunned, his eyes full of disbelief. In the past, this was indeed something we both understood without saying. If we didn't fancy each other, why would Lance so boldly get into fights for me time and time again? And why would I be willing to stay by his side for so many years? In primary and secondary school, before Mom chose schools for me, I would throw tantrums on the floor. "I don't care, I want to go to the same school as Lance." Even earlier, when I had brain surgery for a concussion and wore a cold, hard brace. The kids in the neighborhood called me a monster and refused to play with me. It was Lance who beat them all up. "Whoever doesn't play hide-and-seek with Esther, I'll whack their head with a stick." That Lance was more like a little monster himself, and I was the only one he wanted to protect. From that moment on, I thought that no matter what kind of person Lance became, I would always stand by his side. But reality is never as beautiful as fantasy. Lance changed. And I can change too. I think, perhaps I never really fancied him, I just wanted to always be by his side. Now, I don't even want that anymore. I ignored Lance Sheffield again, but he came looking for me once more. After study hall, he pushed a problem in front of me. "I don't know how to do this." "Teach me," he said. Though he rarely attended class, he still managed to rank in the top 10 of our year. I could tell at a glance that he definitely knew how to solve this problem. But before I could say anything, Irene intercepted Lance. With tears in her eyes, she grabbed Lance's sleeve. "Lance, someone's bullying me. Can you help?" "I'm so scared," she whimpered. Lance's brow furrowed instantly. "Someone's bullying you?" Irene had been absent from school all yesterday afternoon. Sobbing, she said she'd been locked in the toilet and drenched with ice-cold milk. She finished her tale with a sneeze. Then she used Lance's hand to feel her forehead. "Lance, feel this. Do I have a fever? I feel awful. Who did this?" Lance demanded. Irene shrank back a bit. Her gaze shifted towards me. I don't know. I'm afraid to say. Her grades are better than mine. The teachers definitely won't help me." I felt the atmosphere around Lance suddenly darken. His expression turned frighteningly grim. He looked at me. "Did you do this?" The next second, he stood up and violently kicked over my desk. "Esther Lawrence, what's wrong with you? Just because of that milk incident before, was this really necessary?" I frowned deeply. "Yesterday? Milk?" Quickly, I understood what was happening. I looked at Irene. She was crying her eyes out, constantly trying to hide behind Lance. Lance gritted his teeth and sneered. "Esther, I didn't realize you were capable of this. Why do you bother pretending to be a good student?" "Pretending?" I let out a cold laugh, raised my leg, and kicked the overturned desk towards the two of them. No point in coming back here anyway. Lance was stunned for a moment. I had already picked up my packed bag. Whether I'm a good student or not has absolutely nothing to do with you, I said. And Irene, your method of framing people is really not very clever. I spent all of yesterday afternoon in the teacher's office, applying for a transfer. You'd better explain carefully who really poured that milk on you. Irene Quill froze. As soon as I finished speaking, her tears stopped in their tracks on her face. Can't explain it? Huh. I let out a cold laugh. But I saw you buying lots of ice cream after school yesterday. Caught a cold? You're really going all out, aren't you? Her face suddenly turned red. She seemed a bit flustered. She grabbed Lance's sleeve. It's not like that, Lance. Believe me. I was being bullied. But Lance didn't look at her. His gaze lingered on me for a long time. It was as if he had frozen completely after hearing the words transfer schools. Lance, don't listen to her nonsense. Let's go, okay? Take me to buy medicine. Lance shook off Irene's hand. He lowered his eyes and stared straight at me, asking, when did this happen? I paused for 2 seconds, seeing his gaze grow colder. Esther, speak. Transferring schools, when did this happen? The air pressure around him dropped. He became extremely dangerous. I met his gaze and replied expressionlessly. What's it to you? I turned to leave as soon as I finished speaking. But Lance pulled me back by my coat hood. He gripped my wrist with one hand, his eyes tinged with red. Why? Why are you transferring schools? I was getting irritated. Lance and I weren't from the same world. The things he did were always unconventional. Originally, I thought I could fit in with him, understand him. But Lance didn't want that. What he wanted was someone who could be crazy with him. So why can't we just end it here? But why does he have to turn around and provoke me again? Lance's grip on my wrist was painful, and no matter how I struggled, he wouldn't let go. It brought tears to my eyes. I finally stopped moving. Taking a deep breath, I looked at him. Fine, I'll tell you why. Because seeing someone like you who's fallen so low, that you don't even read books anymore, I find it disgusting. Lance's pupils trembled violently. In the moment he was stunned, I pulled my hand free. I casually adjusted my hood. I never looked back at him again. I went home to organize the documents needed for next week's registration. It was quite late before I had time to eat. My mom brought the food into my room. Watching me flip through my old certificates, she suddenly asked, Esther, dear, do you think there's still hope for Lance to study well? I don't know, I replied. I truly didn't know, nor did I care. My mom sat down beside me, lost in thought. A few days ago, his mother Jenny said she's moving abroad with her boyfriend. It's all happening so quickly. I wonder how Lance will take it. Oh well, I used to treat him like my own son, but now he's gone too far. I can't be bothered anymore. I took a moment to process this. So Lance's parents were finally separating for good? I suddenly remembered the beginning of high school. I went to find Lance. He was arguing with his parents. The woman's voice was shrill. You just don't know how good you have it. We only stayed together because of you. Ha, because of me? Lance retorted. Every weekend you get in some other man's car, and Dad often doesn't come home at night. Then you act all lovey-dovey in the same bed. Don't you think you're being perverse? The man smashed a cup. How dare you speak like that? If it weren't for wanting you to get into a good university, do you think we'd want this? Lance stormed out, slamming the door. I stood outside, seeing his red-rimmed eyes. Tears fell from Lance's eyes in an instant. I said nothing, just stood on tiptoe and gently wiped them away. That day in the park, he kept his head down, his voice trembling. Esther, you know what? I'm scared. I don't know when my family will completely fall apart. I understood. It was a feeling of helplessness, being in the eye of the storm. Giving hope. But the result was inevitably despair. Lance always envied my happy family. I envied how he was always healthy enough to win every fight. For over a decade, we constantly drew light from each other. But now, Thinking back, these fragmented memories feel so foreign, as if they belonged to someone else. No matter what, Lance's life has nothing to do with me anymore. Lance's mother came to see me before she left. She said I was his last hope. Lance listens to you the most. If he does anything out of line, please help me talk some sense into him. My mom intervened on my behalf. Jenna dear, we may be old friends, but don't put the child in a difficult position. She fell silent for a moment, then nodded and left. At Central High School, I successfully secured a place for direct entry into university. As I had hoped, I would be going to the University of Edinburgh. As for Lance, I heard he had gotten into several nasty fights. He was becoming increasingly difficult to deal with. As for his studies, he and Irene were the same, neither of them ever made it onto the grade rankings again. They had completely given up on themselves. On exam day, I didn't need to go. The day the results came out had nothing to do with me either. To experience the graduation atmosphere, I went out for a meal with my classmates. As luck would have it, we ran into Lance. He had a bright red cigarette between his fingers. He remembered that he had never touched cigarettes before. Irene stood beside him, her eyes full of disbelief. Lance, what did you say? You want to break up with me? Lance didn't even lift his eyelids. Yes. With a crisp sound, Irene raised her hand and slapped Lance across the face, bursting into tears. I skipped the exams with you, and now you're telling me you want to break up. Why? Lance, tell me why. Lance raised his hand to wipe his face. He laughed carelessly. Do I need a reason? I'm bored, is that okay? He blew a smoke ring at her. Also, do you know what kind of people I hate the most? He paused, as if considering something. Then he revealed a malicious smile. It's people like you, who have fallen so low that they don't even take their exams. Lance, you bloody. Irene was furious. Gritting her teeth, she pointed at Lance's nose. The usually gentle girl swore. You were the one who told me exams were useless. I knew it, I knew your mom abandoned you because you're a complete waste of space. As soon as the words left her mouth, Lance grabbed her by the throat. His eyes were red. What did you say? Say it again? Irene was choking, unable to breathe. She kept hitting Lance's hand, tears in her eyes, but unable to speak. It was at this moment that Lance's gaze suddenly shifted. He saw me. After a brief pause, Lance quickly hid the cigarette behind his back and discreetly extinguished it. His expression was visibly uneasy. Esther, he said. I nodded. How did your exam go? Lance froze. He hesitated for a long time, unable to form a response. My politeness had reached its limit. As I turned to enter the dining room, Lance suddenly grabbed my hand. I looked back, puzzled. Lance's lips were tightly pressed, his eyes dark and turbulent like a stormy lake. Esther, you lied to me, he said. What did I lie about? His voice suddenly became hoarse, his eyes reddening. You said you'd always be there for me. I was stunned and yanked my hand away. Lance, get this straight. Do you have any right to ask me that? But the person even more shocked than me was Irene Quill. There was still a red mark around her neck. She rushed over again. Lance, what are you playing at? She demanded. That's Esther Lawrence, the stuck-up swat who only cares about studying. Isn't that what you said? She tried to push me. What are you looking at, you slag? This is between me and Lance. Before she could finish, Lance grabbed her collar and threw her to the ground. Without giving me time to react, he dragged me forcefully into another private room. It's not like that, Esther. Let me explain, he pleaded. I stared at him steadily, then slowly pried his hands off my shoulders. Lance, have you ever considered respecting other people's feelings? I asked. I'm here to meet friends, and I'm going to be late. I had no desire for further conversation with Lance. He seemed different from before, but I no longer cared to understand him. Besides, what makes you think I want to hear your explanation? I continued. You called me a good girl, a model student. Well, thank you. That's how I got into the University of Edinburgh. Be there for you? How? By becoming a mess like you? You're delusional. I left the room. In the dim light, I could no longer make out Lance's expression. He stood there, motionless, for a very long time. The party was in full swing, with everyone clinking glasses and chatting away. Suddenly, the door opened and an unexpected guest walked into my former desk mate. Her face lit up with joy. "Esther! You're here too," she exclaimed. She was friends with some of the other guests. We hadn't seen each other in a while, and she excitedly told me how well she had done on her exams too. Lance seemed to have been standing outside for quite some time. "Wonder who he's waiting for," she said. I mused, tapping my glass of soda against hers. Who knows? She leaned in curiously. "Do you really not have any feelings left for Lance at all?" I took a sip of my juice before answering. That's right. I knew what she was thinking. Who doesn't have a crush during their teenage years? Most of them probably end up going nowhere though. My former desk mate sighed. I envy you. But I still hope the person I like will like me back. Realizing her wistful comment may have been inappropriate, she quickly added. But that Irene is such a witch. I silently swirled my drink, unable to offer any comment. A couple days later, I heard that Irene had been beaten up. It was that gang leader from before. He still held a grudge from when he got beaten up himself. He had been warned to stay away from school for a while, so he didn't dare make a move there. But after graduation, he finally found his chance. He cornered Irene in an alley and punched her hard several times. You think you're so clever with your smart mouth, don't you? I never cursed at you before, he snarled. But those shoes you're wearing today are bloody hideous. Having vented his anger, he then shoved a phone into Irene's hands. Go on, call someone, he taunted. Call that Sheffield bloke over, and I'll stop hitting you. Sobbing, Irene called Lance. He picked up, but quickly hung up in annoyance. After that, the line was busy. Because Lance was calling me instead. He said he was at the hospital. Hospital? Lance's voice was dejected, trembling. Esther, can you come see me? It hurts so much. Did you get into a fight? Yeah. I took a deep breath, feeling a bit exasperated. Lance, you brought this on yourself. I'm not responsible. Don't hang up yet. I was about to end the call. He suddenly added, Esther, please. The old wound got infected. There's no one to accompany me for surgery. I'm scared. His voice lowered, as if admitting something embarrassing. Towards the end, it was barely audible. Please. I couldn't help but recall the past. Lance always hated going to the hospital when he was sick, trying to tough it out. That's how he ended up with acute gastritis. The painless gastroscopy required a companion, but his parents weren't home that day. Lance once said that both his parents had their own lives. Once they left that home, phone calls rarely got through. I was the one who accompanied Lance. He smiled brightly. Esther, don't you think it's pathetic that my life has come to this? I shook my head. Not at all. When Lance woke up from the anesthesia, I was sitting beside him. He hung his head, his nose a bit stuffy. Esther, thank you, he said. But at that moment, I clearly saw a hint of melancholy in his eyes. That day, I vaguely felt something was different. Later I understood. In Lance's eyes, our circumstances were different. I could never truly empathize with his situation. All he could say to me was a simple thank you. There was an insurmountable chasm between us from birth. When we were little, everyone wanted to be the hero saving the world. Growing up, we gradually realized no one would save us. For Lance, I wasn't as useful as Irene. They could share their hardships, while I simply didn't qualify. I didn't go to the hospital. I never answered Lance's calls again. His suffering let him bear it alone. I cut off all contact with Lance Sheffield. My mom still keeps in touch with his mother occasionally. I heard that his mom got pregnant abroad. When she learned that Lance didn't take the A-levels, she fell silent. That boy, I can't control him anymore. Let his father deal with it. But Lance's father quickly started a new family as well. After all, we watched him grow up. My mom felt a bit sorry for him. What did this child do wrong to end up like this, she wondered. I don't know. Lance's life and mine are two parallel lines. In theory, they should never have intersected. It was our effort to get close that gave us those 19 years of companionship. If he didn't do anything wrong, then I certainly didn't either. I worked hard to get into the university I wanted and live the life I desired, nothing more. Before university started, I saw Lance for the last time. He was waiting outside my building. He had been waiting for a long time. I didn't understand why he insisted on keeping in touch with me. Esther, there's something I must tell you. I looked at him silently. After not seeing him for a while, much of his youthful air seemed to have worn off. He had also lost some weight. His smile was still pure, just a bit bitter. I like you, he said. After he finished, I unconsciously stiffened. In the silent confrontation, Lance turned his head away first. At that moment, I realized I might have been waiting for those words for a very long time. But that was in the past. I shook my head. No need to say that. I don't like you either. Lance gave a bitter laugh. I know. You're going to university. Someone like me isn't good enough for you. No, Lance, I interrupted him. You should understand, I never cared what kind of person you were. He suddenly looked up and saw my unusually serious expression. The summer breeze rolled in with a wave of heat. It blew our fringes up. Our gazes collided unobstructed. I smiled with relief. I used to think we might always be close. But Lance, you chose someone else, you chose a different path. So we each have to take responsibility for our own choices. Lance didn't speak for a long time. He understood what I meant. As I was about to go upstairs, he suddenly called out to me. His voice trembled badly. But Esther, I regret it. What should I do? I regret it. You're the one I like. I shouldn't have gotten together with Irene. I shouldn't have missed the A-levels. At this point, I didn't stop walking. I didn't look back either. His voice faded in the rustling summer wind. Slowly, it became inaudible. I entered university with high hopes. I made new friends. I started a new life. But Lance Sheffield was no longer part of it. After some time, my former desk mate came to tell me some news. She was now with the boy she liked. Esther! Can you believe how lucky I am? I finally gathered the courage to confess, and it turns out he likes me too. I was truly happy for her. Mutual love and lifelong companionship are perhaps the two hardest things to achieve in this world. I wished her a long and happy relationship. What about you? Do you fancy anyone? I thought for a moment. There's a senior I've been getting along well with lately. Oh, come on, if you like him just say so. I smiled but said nothing more. Later at home, I overheard some news about Lance from my mom. He was repeating his final year. At the same school as before. But Irene Quill was no longer there. She was from a poor family and couldn't afford to repeat the year. She tried confronting Lance several times. She regretted her choices too. I never should have skipped classes with you. Lance completely ignored her. Eventually, Irene stopped pestering Lance. Her family took her back home. They found her a good match for marriage. When all her prayers went unanswered, she bizarrely decided to come find me. Esther, don't you think you owe me? It's been so long, have you lost your mind? She suddenly became agitated. If you had kept your childhood friend in check, he wouldn't have led me astray. I found it laughable. I asked her, do you think Lance and I would have dated early if it weren't for you? Why else would you study so hard if not to beat me in other ways? I was speechless. Her logic was too absurd to even argue with. In hindsight, it's no wonder she was so easily led astray by Lance. I gave her one last piece of advice out of kindness. Studying hard is the fairest path forward for everyone. To my surprise, she retorted, stop pretending. I sighed and blocked her. A year later, Lance took his A-levels. He had always been a good student and easily scored high enough for the University of Edinburgh. He came to see me. Esther, if you don't want to see me, I won't go. As it happened, my boyfriend was there that day. He came out from behind me, and Lance froze on the spot. Is this your classmate? My boyfriend asked. I nodded and turned to Lance. What were you saying just now? Looking closely, I noticed he was holding a tiny folded paper star in his hand. It looked familiar. Then I remembered I had folded it during my hospital stay for a concussion when we were kids. I had given the most perfect one to Lance. One star can grant one wish. Lance held the star out to me. Esther, does this still count? I looked at it for a moment. Then I took my boyfriend's arm and smiled. It was just a childhood game. The creases on that little star were worn and tattered. Even in the sunlight, it looked dull and gray. Nothing truly remains unchanged. The past. Let it stay in the past.